Picture this. You're standing on the edge of an ancient, sprawling forest. You're watching the sunrise over these pristine rivers and just boundless grasslands. It's a continent completely pulsing with life, entirely uncolonized, but deeply, intentionally cared for. Okay, let's dive right into this, because today in this explainer, we're traveling way, way back in time, long before the year 1788, to explore the grand estate of the Australian continent. We're going to uncover the incredible story of the first Australians. And trust me, it is a story of monumental demographic scale, profound linguistic diversity, and some of the absolute most sophisticated land management practices the world has literally ever seen.
So, what did Australia really look like before 1788? To answer that, we actually have to completely shatter a massive historical misconception. For centuries, colonial narratives painted the Australian continent as this empty, untouched wilderness, right? Like it was just this wild frontier waiting to be improved by European agriculture. But the historical record, it tells a completely different story. I want you to basically reimagine this entire continent. It was absolutely not an untamed wilderness. It was this meticulously managed, thriving landscape that had been shaped and cultivated by the hands of its inhabitants over, unimaginable stretches of time.
And when I say unimaginable stretches of time, I really mean it. 65,000 years. Just let that sink in for a second. To put that into perspective, that is tens of thousands of years before the pyramids were even a thought. That staggering number is the upper estimate of how long ago the ancestors of Aboriginal Australians first moved into what we now call the Australian continent. They arrived via these land bridges and short sea crossings from maritime Southeast Asia during the last glacial period, and they spread across the entire landmass. I mean, we're talking about a people who survived literal ice ages, massive fluctuations in sea levels, dramatic shifts in temperature, the whole shebang. Today, the Medjed Bay rock shelter up in the continent's north stands as perhaps the oldest site of human occupation in Australia. It anchors this history of survival and resilience that is honestly almost beyond our modern comprehension.
And this brilliantly illustrates the sheer scale of deep time we're talking about. Look at these massive chronological leaps. By 46,000 years ago, early fire stick farming was already underway, which we'll get into more in a bit. Jump to 41,000 years ago, and we find the oldest human remains at Lake Mungo in New South Wales. And what's truly fascinating here is that there's evidence of one of the world's oldest known cremations. That points to profound and incredibly early religious rituals. Then, if we zoom forward to about 14,000 years ago, as global temperatures rose and the ice caps melted, the rising sea levels actually caused Tasmania to completely separate from the mainland, isolating those populations for millennia.
So from that vast, kind of dizzying timeline of deep time, let's zoom in on the actual human scale of this society right before British colonization. The continent wasn't just some monolith. Instead, it was this dynamic, interconnected web of distinct societies. We're looking at a continent of thriving nations, where each one had its own identity, its own laws, and its own deep, deep connection to very specific regions of the landscape.
And the sheer scale of this demographic diversity is just absolutely mind-blowing. Estimates of the Aboriginal population at the time of European contact range from 300,000 all the way up to 1 million people across the continent. This massive population was organized into roughly 600 distinct clan groups, or nations. But here is the truly staggering part, okay? They spoke over 250 distinct languages. Add in all the various localized dialects, and the magnitude of that diversity is just incredible to think about. Day to day, though, the social structure was very intimate and cooperative. They typically organized into family bands averaging about 25 people. These semi-nomadic groups moved around specific territories that, they weren't marked by fences or anything. Instead, they were beautifully defined by spiritual and natural geographical features.
Now, what's really interesting is how this fundamentally challenges old, overly simplistic labels. You'll often hear anthropologists describe traditional Aboriginal Australia as a complex hunter-gatherer society. But why complex? Well, because these thriving communities completely defy the cliché of just, endlessly wandering the desert looking for food. They had highly structured societies with cooperative economies. They engineered these incredibly sophisticated fish farming systems. Some groups even built semi-permanent shelters and engaged in highly organized seasonal harvests. They were managing resources with a very acute, almost scientific understanding of their environment.
Which brings us perfectly to the concept of land management. The first Australians weren't just passively living on the land. They were actively cultivating and transforming it. They were literally engineers of the ecosystem. Through continuous observation and generations of accumulated knowledge, they actively shaped the biodiversity and the geography of the entire continent to ensure stability and abundance.
And the most masterful ecological tool they possessed to do this was something called fire stick farming. The mechanics behind it are just incredibly fascinating to unpack. So first, they would intentionally set these low-intensity, controlled fires to clear out dense, choked vegetation. And this wasn't destructive, right? It was totally regenerative. Second, by clearing out all that underbrush, it made travel across the vast landscape significantly easier for the nomadic bands. But step 3 is where the real payoff happens. Imagine engineering an entire ecosystem's food supply using just controlled fire. These burns actively created wide open grasslands. And those grasslands were incredibly rich in vegetable food sources, and they drew in large game animals looking to feed on the fresh green shoots. They were quite literally farming with fire to guarantee their food supply. It's genius.
Now, to maintain such a finely tuned ecosystem over thousands of years, you need a highly stable social structure, and their approach to authority was remarkably effective. Let's compare these societal authority models for a second. Unlike the rigid formal hierarchies you'd see in Europe at the time, Aboriginal society was deeply egalitarian. There was no single ruler dictating everything from the top down. Actually, authority rested mostly with the elders, and group decisions were generally made through their consensus. The economy itself was entirely cooperative. Men generally hunted the large game, women gathered local staples like seeds, nuts, and shellfish, and absolutely everything was shared within the group. They even exchanged resources across different clan groups. This cooperative nature is really what created such an incredibly resilient and stable society.
Let's move to the next point and see how this builds into their technological timeline, particularly as the Earth's climate shifted over the millennia. So about 19,000 years ago, global temperatures and sea levels began to rise, and Aboriginal societies responded with incredible innovation. We start seeing small, highly refined backbladed stone tools appearing between 15,000 and 19,000 years ago. Fast forward to 10,000 years ago, and sophisticated wooden javelins and the iconic boomerangs arrive on the scene. Between 5,000 and 7,000 years ago, newly crafted stone points for spears emerge. And then, around 4,000 years ago up in the north, we witness the rise of the ethnically and culturally distinct Torres Strait Islander people. They developed this highly specialized, village-based maritime and agricultural culture.
But, the mastery of physical survival is really only half the story here. The cultural legacy is just as profound. The artistic, musical, and spiritual traditions they established are among the longest surviving in human history. We found Aboriginal rock art, stuff like handprints, stencils, and engravings that dates back an astonishing 35,000 years. And by 20,000 years ago, artists were intricately depicting humans and animals. What we're looking at is an unbroken chain of human creativity, meaning-making, and storytelling, one that literally outlasts almost every other civilization on Earth.
So the crucial point here is that all of this, the land management, the egalitarian society, the incredible art, it was all bound together by a deeply held animist framework. Central to this is the dreaming, and it's important to understand this wasn't just a collection of myths, it was the foundational law. The dreaming is a sacred era where ancestral totemic spirit beings moved across the unformed earth and created everything. And in doing so, they established the laws of society, the structures of kinship, and the vital ceremonies that absolutely had to be performed to ensure the continuity of life. Because they believed all natural features were created by these ancestral beings, a person's specific country didn't just give them food, it provided their deepest physical and spiritual nourishment. As we reach the end of our explainer today, I really want to leave you with this provocative question. What can modern society learn from 65,000 years of sustainable land management and the world's oldest continuous culture? Think about it. When we strip away all those historical misconceptions and just look at the hard data, the massive population sizes of up to 1 million people, the complex cooperative economies, the deliberate ecological engineering, and these incredibly enduring spiritual laws, we aren't just looking at the past. We are looking at an absolute masterclass in human resilience and sustainability. It challenges us to reevaluate what we think we know about history. And more importantly, it asks how we might carry these ancient, vital lessons forward into our own future. Thanks so much for joining me for this exploration, and hey, always keep questioning the history you've been taught.